Zada Hedron Grinder is my favorite card. It's extremely powerful, fun, and versatile. There are a lot of different ways you can build Zada, but before we go over them, I'll read the card. Zada Hedron Grinder is 3 and a red for a 3/3 legendary creature goblin ally. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell that targets only Zada Hedron Grinder, copy that spell for each other creature you control that the spell could target. Each copy targets a different one of those creatures. This is a bit hard to understand, so let's demonstrate the effect with Crimson Wisps, Zada, and 5 goblins. Crimson Wisps is red for an instant. Target creature becomes red and gains haste until end of turn. Draw a card. We cast Crimson Wisps targeting Zada. Since it's an instant that only targets Zada, then Zada will trigger. It will make a copy of Crimson Wisps targeting each of our goblins. We get to choose the order that the copies resolve as long as the Zada copy, the original spell, resolves last. This way, all of our creatures will get haste and we will draw 6 cards. This is the power of Zada and the way we can abuse it. There are a lot of other things we can take advantage of, but making copies is what we do. And in most, if not all versions of Zada, we will still get some use out of this type of draw. We can also use this effect to pump everything, untap all our creatures, flicker all of our creatures, and more. There are a lot of different ways to build around Zada. I got a list of 10 commanders and 5 archetypes that you can build around, which makes the decision very difficult. So let's start with the most simple build of Zada and move on from there. Running Zada as the commander of a token, draw, pump deck. This version can easily compete in high power and would need deliberate lowering of power level or budget to compete in mid or low power. The game plan works like this. First, get out tokens, mana, and Zada. Once we have all these parts, we are ready for the turn where we try to win. Usually, you first cast a few cards that draw you a card and target a creature. This way we can draw into pump spells, which we can use when we attack. Once we have a few pump spells though, we can cast them. And since Zada replicates to all of our creatures, pumping them up to the point where we can kill our opponents is surprisingly easy. There are a lot of token generators in red that can make multiple creatures for cheap, like Young Pyromancer, Dragon Fodder, Krenko's Command, and Hortling Outburst. These and many more allow us to create a lot of creatures very quickly. Mana dorks and artifacts are a good way to get mana, and we can use cards like Battle Hymn, Sudden Breakthrough, and Traitorous Greed as a way to get mana while we storm off. Or Karizev's Expertise for free casting. We can also use draw like Renegade Tactics, Expedite, and Crimson Wisps to draw us a ton of cards. Then we can pump our creatures with cards like Screaming Fury, Fists of the Anvil, Borrowed Hostility, and Teamer Battle Rage, until we have enough damage to win. You can also build this around Storm instead of Pump, but most of these decks will be very similar. This is the most basic and the most powerful way of building Zada. So let's branch out a bit and add more colors. General Tazri is 4 and a white for a 3/4 legendary creature human ally. It has an ability for white, blue, black, red, green. This ability is extremely rare to use, but with color identity rules, it's considered a 5-color commander. It reads, when General Tazri enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an ally creature card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. This is good since Zada is an ally, and you can search for Zada once you play it. This is the most versatile commander for Zada and can lead to a lot of archetypes like Pump, Storm, Untap, and Flicker. Let's talk about Pump first since it's closest to what we do with Zada as a commander. We can run token generators similar to before, but we have more colors and more options. Then we run a lot of draw copy cards and Pump so we can kill our opponents. Another advantage to having many colors is the selection of Pump cards. We can run cards like Appeal to Authority, Exhilarating Elocution, Phalanx Tactics, Confront the Unknown, Fortifying Draw, and many similar effects to pump our creatures exponentially. Think of these as Craterhoof Behemoths, which are cheap in CMC and price. Compared to Zada as the commander, the upside is you have more colors, and therefore more options of what to run. And the downside is that we have to cast Tazri before we can get Zada. If you just want a faster or more efficient deck, I would play Zada. But if you want a different archetype, want a slower deck, or just want more colors, I would do Tazri. Next, let's talk about Storm. This is also commonly played with just Zada as the commander. The idea of Storm is to cast as many spells in a turn as possible, and then use that to trigger cards like Aetherflux Reservoir or Storm cards and win the game that way. In order to make that work with Tazri Zada, we run draw replicating cards. If we can pay 1 mana and draw 6 or 7 cards, this can become a highly effective Storm deck, because you just draw into another cantrip you can play. So let's think about what you need for Storm. First of all, you need cards to cast. We solve this with our draw a card, target a creature cards. With Zada, we can draw a card for each creature we control for just 1 or 2 mana. If we have enough of these effects and enough creatures, we can cast one, draw into another, cast it, draw into another, rinse and repeat until we play a Storm card. This simple plan can work, but there are a lot of different ways to optimize it. Most Storm decks run rituals to get extra mana, and we will still run a lot of the typical. But there are also some Zada specific ones which work too. Battle Hymn and Sudden Breakthrough give us mana for each of our creatures, and Trader's Greed gives us 2 mana per creature. Swell of Growth, Enter the Unknown, and Scale the Heist give us extra land draws, and 2 of the 3 let us look for more lands to play. But with so much draw, we can usually use a lot of the land drops either way. Another thing to think about is Magecraft. Magecraft is a keyword that triggers every time you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell. Because we are casting many cheap cards that get replicated by Zada, it's insanely easy to get dozens and dozens of triggers from these. With something like Witherbloom Apprentice, we can deal a lot of damage. With Stormkiln Artist, we can get a lot of mana. And with Sedgemoor Witch or Dika, we can double the amount of creatures we have every time we cast a target spell. Another possibility is cards like Young Pyromancer, Saheeli Sublime Artificer, and Monastery Men. These will make tokens as you storm up, but not on the copy. There is a balance with these though. If you lean too much on these and run too many, or you run the expensive ones, it will be hard to start storming off, but if you use these in moderation and avoid the less powerful iterations, you can get good use out of them. This is a very powerful deck and a lot of fun to go off with. It's definitely slower than a normal Zada deck, but it can definitely work in mid power. Let's go a bit farther from typical now with Flicker. Just like we can copy our pump and draw effects, we can copy our flicker effects. Take Cloud Shift for example. It's a white for an instant. Exile target creature, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. With this and Zada, it will replicate and flicker an entire board for just 1 mana. This still uses General Tazri as the commander, and to great effect. There are many big reasons for this. 1, our commander will search for Zada. 2, our commander has an ETB ability. Every time we flicker it, it will search for another ally. This brings me to what I call Zada Ally Flicker. It's an amazing mashup of effects that I have a deck built around. This is actually my favorite deck, and it works pretty well. It needs a tune-up, but I really enjoy playing it. Anyways, I should explain the archetype. Allies have a keyword called Rally. It triggers whenever it or another ally enters the battlefield under our control. As previously stated, we have many flicker cards. These are cheap, and when replicated by Zada, they can flicker our entire board for 1 to 3 mana. The goal is to get out a board of allies. Flicker them all and get tons and tons of rally triggers. This becomes much easier when we consider that our commander gets us another ally when we flicker it, and we can run changelings to increase the number of playable allies, and that we can still run a lot of draw to get even more allies. Alright, now I've tuned up my Tazri deck, let's talk about the deck I built. Starting out with a good bunch of allies is extremely helpful, so we run 18 of them. We run 8 cards which make copies of our creatures, 11 pieces of ramp, 7 pieces of removal, 9 pieces of draw, and 12 flicker cards. We have a lot of good allies and can get a lot of rally triggers from them. Some good examples include Kalastria Healer, Tiger Diabolist, and Halimar Excavator, all of which kill our opponent. We can also run changelings like Irregular Cohort, Realm Walker, and Orvar to get us more allies. Our clone cards are mostly split into 2 categories. Clones for our allies, which we can flicker, and cards which make tokens copies of target creature we control. Since these target creatures, they will replicate the entire board for just 2 or 3 mana. The clones for our allies that we can flicker will enter as a copy of an ally. When we flicker, we can have them re-enter as the copy of another ally, and we will get all the relevant rally triggers. Replicating our board is incredibly powerful. If we replicate something with rally, it will end up triggering itself and the original version when it or another ally enters the battlefield. And that makes winning or doing damage a whole lot easier. We also, of course, have ramp. This includes cards like Wood Elves, Springbloom Druid, and Elvish Rejuvenator, which will get us lands, curve into my commander, and have the potential to get more lands when they get flickered. We have cards like Sudden Breakthrough, Karizev's Expertise, and Enter the Unknown to get mana by replicating with Zada. We also have a few allies which ramp us. We have a good amount of draw, specifically 9 cards, a lot of which replicate with Zada. And we have our flicker cards. Most of these are similar to Cloud Shift. Exile target creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. Some cards draw a card, like Acrobatic Maneuver and Illusionist Stratagems, and some return it on the end step, like Long Road Home and Teferi's Time Twist. Let's move on to the next method of building, untap. The idea here is to run creatures and untap cards that can replicate. There are a lot of different ways to take advantage of tapping and untapping creatures, but I like the idea of pingers and mana dorks, so I'm going to do it this way. This centers around Zada and replicating untap. Take Burst of Strength, for example. It's green for an instant. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature and untap it. Because of Zada, you can put counters on all of your creatures and untap them all. This version is unique because Zada isn't required required, you can still untap one of your creatures with this spell and get a lot of the value. Untapping multiple creatures is so much better because 1. We will untap multiple pingers if we have them. 2. We will untap our mana dorks and get more mana. We can untap creatures which untap other creatures to activate a specific pinger twice. So what are pingers? Creatures that tap to deal 1 damage to another creature. Next we need untappers. Hero's Follower, Fate Stitcher, and Vizier of Tumbling Sand are good examples. We are specifically looking for creatures with a tap ability that can untap other creatures. These are good since we will untap all of our creatures, then we can get more use out of our pingers. We also need mana dorks. If we run enough of these, our untapped cards might be like ritual. This is a very unique build of pingers, and your opponents will likely have never seen anything like it. It does need a lot of pieces though, and can be difficult to balance, so it might need to go in low power. While recording, I realized I sort of missed an archetype: clones. Now, it is a bit of a stretch, and I'm not sure how well it would work, but it's at least worth investigating. We can split between normal/permanent clones to get some copies early, and instant and sorcery clones that target creatures to double the number of copies. These are the biggest archetypes with Tazri Zada, but we also have to talk about Magecraft and other synergistic cards. These groups will work in almost any Zada deck, and it's good to check them while building. So what is Magecraft? Magecraft is a keyword that triggers whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery. You can see the power of this when you consider that Zada replicates our spells to all of our creatures, and that those are considered copies. Let's go through some busted examples. Sedgemoor Witch and Dika give us tokens from our spells, so every time we cast a spell that replicates with Zada, we will get a token for every creature we control. Stormkiln Artist gives us a treasure for each cast or copy, so we will get a lot of mana that way. Archmage Emeritus leads to a lot of draw, and Witherbloom Apprentice will deal huge amounts of damage. Building a deck around Magecraft is possible, but I just don't think it's worth it. We also have the Synergy category. These cards are just good in a lot of Zada decks. Killing Ink Duelist makes everything that targets Zada cheaper. Fiery Gambit has a decent chance of drawing us 9 cards and untapping all of our lands. I wouldn't consider this a good card, but it is quite fun. Feather and Mavinda let us get our cards back, Gargos lets us fight, and Mirrorwing Dragon has the same effect as Zada. Ink Treader Nephilim also has a similar ability to Zada, but it will replicate to our opponent's creatures as well. Sometimes this is a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing. It just depends. Most Zada decks will still fit within Flicker, Pump, Untap, and Storm, but there are options other than General Tazri and Zada for the commander. Niv Mizzet Parun gives us a way to turn our draw into damage. This does help a lot, but the fixing is hard. Kykar Wind's Fury gives us tokens while we cast our spells, and it gives us a mana. It's a great way to support the deck. Krenko Mob Boss will create huge amounts of tokens for us to profit from. This can work incredibly well, but red just doesn't have too many tutors for Zada or Mirrorwing Dragon. Krenko Tinstreak Kingpin makes tokens when it attacks equal to its power. This means that if we run a lot of pump spells for target creature and Zada, that in the early game they can be used to pump Krenko and get us a lot of creatures, and in the late game they will be replicated with Zada, and we can likely deal enough damage to win. It's a good commander for Zada and can still function for Zada, which partially makes up for the lack of tutors in red. Feather the Redeemed says, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell that targets a creature you control, exile that card instead of putting it into your graveyard as it resolves. If you do, return it to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. This has a lot of overlap with the archetypes of Zada Tazri, and will be a great Zada commander. You can do Flicker, Pump, Draw, Untap, and more. The last option for commander isn't technically legal as a commander. Ink Treader Nephilim. I and many other people argue that the Nephilims should have been legendary, and it's common for them to be allowed as commanders. This is a good way to use Rule 0. Anyways, the card is white, blue, red, green for 3/3. Whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery, if Ink Treader Nephilim is the only target for that spell, copy the spell for each other creature that spell could target. Each copy targets a different one of those creatures. This can be better than Zada for something like Draw, since we get more cards, or worse for something like Pump, since our opponent's stuff is pumped as well. Usually you would build this with Storm. Magecraft works especially well, and Splice into Arcane or Untap might sort of work. Another thing to note about Ink Treader Nephilim is that an opponent's piece of removal becomes a wrath, so running protection that allows you to target it becomes extra important. Zada decks are also surprisingly budget friendly, since there aren't very many expensive cards that can't be cut or replaced with something else. Another thing which is relevant to most, if not all of these versions, is the time and difficulty of playing Zada. There are many rules questions and difficult things to resolve, which takes time to figure out. Remember, you can choose the order that the copies resolve as long as the Zada copy or the original spell resolves last. You also may be casting many spells in a turn. Planning the best order to cast and resolve these spells, and then doing that plan is very difficult to think of, remember, and explain to your opponents. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't play Zada, but if you're coming right from a precon with minimal experience playing Magic, I can't really recommend it. As I said in the beginning, Zada Hedron Grinder is my favorite card, and the builds you can make around it are near endless. For this reason, I have made many different versions and decks. I will leave them linked below. Some are well thought out, and some are unfinished, but it can help you find relevant cards. If you make a list, leave a comment, and I'd be happy to see it. And if I helped, subscribe. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.